Everyone wants to live an inspired life, yet so many people search for happiness following the footsteps of peers and taking advice from people who have different values and outcomes to which they're searching. There are people born into wealth, graduated from the best universities in the world, and there are people who have none of that and yet are living extraordinary lives full of fulfillment and reward. The purpose of this podcast is to share insights and strategies that allow you to question the status quo and think freely, so you can design your life and be who you want to be. We get one life. Time is our most valuable asset. I believe that when we're free and able to focus on meaningful work, we become better human beings. This is always free, and I'm your host, Jason Graystone.
Welcome to the leading podcast for financial empowerment and wealth creation. Subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. You can connect with Jason on social media and subscribe to the Jason Graystone YouTube channel for weekly videos. Don't forget to also subscribe to the weekly newsletter to receive frequent educational content and action steps to help you design your life so you can be who you want to be. For news on all future events and updates, go to jasongraystone.com.
Welcome back to the podcast. Hopefully you enjoyed episode 1. If you haven't listened to episode 1, go back. Feel free to go back and listen to that. Really, the pilot episode or episode 1 of this podcast was just designed to give you a bit more of a deeper understanding of who I am, where I grew up, so that you didn't sort of just to sort of demolish any kind of pedestal or fantasy that you had about some kind of dream life that I was blessed with or anything like that. I just wanted to put us on level playing fields because I really didn't, I really wasn't born into wealth. I didn't have any sort of advantage other than the fact that I was healthy. All right, so I was a pretty healthy kid, and really apart from that, I just started off like most people out in life. So hopefully you enjoyed that. If you haven't listened to that, go back and check out the first episode there. And as mentioned, this podcast is going to be divided into kind of sections. So I'm going to really kick it off with a question that I've either received by email or instant messenger or just one of the comments on one of my social media channels, something like that. And I'll kick the podcast off like that. And that theme will kind of carry on through the podcast. So this week, I'm going to talk about a question that I got recently, and someone reached out to me. So for those of you who don't know me and you're listening for the first time, my name's Jason Graystone. I'm a professional currency trader and investor. I'm an entrepreneur. I've built businesses. And one of the questions that I got recently is, why did you get into trading? So I'm going to sort of talk a bit about why I got into trading, because it filters out nicely into really what became my life's work or my life strategy to get that level of financial independence. So I'm going to share that with you. I'm going to give you a bit of a back history there. So before I got into trading, before I even knew what trading was, in fact, I didn't really know what trading was until very late on. So, I'm talking about 8 years ago that I really first found out what trading was all about. And I wasn't really going to get into trading at all. But I'll take you back to when I sort of started to put this strategy together to replace my income, because I spoke in the last podcast about giving you guys an insight into how I did that and what the mindset was behind it. But before we get into the strategy side, the actual, the crux, the bones of it, I'll just briefly sort of explain how I even got on this path. So when I was about 18, 19, I knew I didn't want to be on the tools forever. Okay, I didn't want to be on the tools forever. In fact, the first job that I had, I very quickly moved up the ranks. I didn't want to be on the tools. I became interested in software development. I wanted to design systems. I had quite a logical mind, so I could put together, an engineer's mind, if you like. I could put together strategies and software. I was good at sketching stuff out and doing logic, and I completely self-taught myself how to do software and things like that. So I was about 18, 19, and I was really starting to think about where my life was going in terms of finances, because I just had to turn down a job at the fire brigade. I finally got into the fire brigade, and as I said, I was sort of earning more money now by this point than I would get offered in the fire brigade. The fire brigade are completely undervalued, and they don't get paid as much as they're worth, nowhere near, same as the police force, same as the NHS, same as the military. These people who are, very, very altruistic, serving the community, serving humanity, and putting their life on the line, they really aren't, they're really undervalued in my opinion. And they were looking at something like £22,000 per year at the time, plus something called London waiting, which was like to cover your expenses basically. And that was about 2,000 or 3,000. So I was looking about 25 grand. And at the time I was earning almost more than double that in my job as a 19-year-old, 20-year-old kid. So I was doing quite well in my job. I had a decent income, but I was I didn't really, I thought I need to put a plan together. I need to know what's going on. I need some kind of financial plan. And I'd recently started reading a load of books. I started, searching up on the internet, and I was reading books. The internet was really just coming into its own there. You had MSN Messenger and all those kind of platforms, but Yahoo, that was around, and MSN and all that kind of stuff. So I had access to that, and I was fascinated with people like Kiyosaki, Ray Dalio. Ray Dalio's been an absolute hero of mine. In fact, through this podcast, I'm going to be talking a lot about Principles, which is a book written by Ray Dalio, and it's a book that I absolutely study in life. I was fascinated by people like that. I was fascinated by people like Warren Buffett and Ben Graham, and also I really, really enjoyed a book that I read by a guy called James Davidson, and the book was called The Sovereign Individual, and that was where I really first heard about something called Pareto's Law. And for those of you who don't know what Pareto's Law is, I'm going to be talking about it in future episodes. But it's essentially where 80% of the output comes from 20% of the input. So you focus 80% of your efforts into the 20% most important things, and you get 80% output from that. So I became sort of fascinated with these maths and these formulas, and I started to devise a plan of how I could use my money. I'd obviously done a little car wash and all the rest of it, but I was now earning some money, and I wanted to put a plan together so that I could utilize my money as best as possible. So I didn't plan for financial, I didn't plan to replace my income at that point, but I knew I wanted to use my money to gain the biggest output. I wanted to allow my money to work so that I could get the biggest return from putting my money to work. And out of all of the books that I read, it was actually the Pareto's Law that just sparked a little light bulb moment, particularly later on down the line. So anyway, I basically, after studying Warren Buffett, Kiyosaki, Dalio, Ben Graham, and James Davidson, they were really sort of the 5, maybe 4, 5, 6 books that I'd read at the time, as well as this was actually before I read Think and Grow Rich. But I came to the conclusion. I did some maths, and I did I had this little formula drawn out, and I built a spreadsheet in Excel. Anyway, after reading all those books, I kind of got the gist that people were telling to save 10% of your income, right? So I did some maths on this, and I worked out that if you save 10% of your income, there's a slight problem, because you can save 10% of your income, okay, but you have to realize that after 10 years of doing that, you've essentially generated 1 year's worth of income. So you save 10% of your income, 10 years go by, you've got 1 full year of income, right? Makes sense? And I thought, well, if most people work for 40 years, well, that's 4 times 10. Well, I'm going to have like 4 years income. So I'm going to literally work and save 10% for 40 years and really just come out the back end to have enough to live for 4 years. And that didn't sound really attractive. And as I started looking into it a bit more, I realized that there was things like inflation, okay? I realized that most people weren't saving 10%, and they weren't even looking at 4 years at the end of their working life. And I thought, well, what's to say, why aren't they doing that? What's to say I'm going to do that? And that sort of scared me a little bit as well. I thought maybe there's something I'm not catching on to here. Maybe I'm missing something. And then there was like inflation, and then there was the thought of, well, when I do retire, I'm going to have more time, and am my living expenses going to be the same, or am I going to have more time, therefore I'm going to want to spend more money? And anyway, I was sort of doing some rough maths, and I worked out that I'd probably have around 2 years to live before I run out of money. And I thought, well, that's flawed. I must be missing something. So I'm not just going to save 10% and just stash it under a pillow somewhere. That's not going to be for me. And I started looking more and more at different alternatives. So people were saying, well, a pension's a good idea. And I started looking at a pension, and, the pension all looked good and everything. And everyone seemed to be doing the pension. It was something I'd heard when I went for the fire brigade. Oh, the pension's brilliant, right? And I started looking at pensions, and I started researching them and figuring out, what sort of people were doing. And I started by looking, actually, I found a guy online who was running a webinar, and he ran this webinar, and the first thing he said was the average life expectancy for a man is 75 years old. And I thought, okay, 75 years old. I hope I'm going to live to a lot longer than that. I think I'm going to live 100 or beyond, but 75 years old, let's go with that. But he then said the average retirement age is 65. Okay, so, well, 65, and the average age is, average life expectancy is 75. So if we retire at 65, we need enough money to live until we're 75, right? But then I looked up the average pension pot in the UK, and the average UK pension pot's it was around 85, 86, 87 grand, something like that at the time. And anyway, I worked out that it was you would have to live on about 7 to 8 grand per year for 10 years, for the best, like the golden years of your life. So you've spent all your time working, you've spent all your life working, 40 years, put it in the graft, done the service, neglected some school trips or school plays from your kids. You've maybe missed their birthday morning because you had to work, and you've really sacrificed a lot of time, valuable time, with your family. And you've put in the 40 years, and at the end of it, you come out and you go, right, I'm free, and you can barely move because you're not agile, you've put in the graft, you're 65 years old, your knees are playing up, your hair's fallen out, you're a bit achy, and you're not as sort of nimble as you used to be. and you've got to live on 7 grand a year. 7 grand a year, right? That is like, you're basically living off of microwave meals when you should be living, enjoying life at that age. And it got me thinking, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to go through life, put in the graph, get to 65, and then have 10 years where you've got to live on 7 grand a year? And then I thought, you've got to hope that you don't live beyond 75. Because once the money's run out, you're turning to your kids. You're turning to other family members, and then you have to, put yourself in this position. Imagine you in this position. You've got to then go and be a burden on your kids. Now, I'm not saying your kids would see it as a burden, but it's a financial strain and burden that I wouldn't want to be. I wouldn't want to be on my kids. I would not want to get to 75, run out of money, and and then be a financial drain on my children. So I definitely didn't want to do that. That was absolutely flawed. And I thought, there's got to be something wrong. Why hasn't everyone figured this out? So anyway, started looking at how I can I started looking at the 80-20 rule. I became fascinated with the 80-20 rule, and I had this, how can I make the most out of what I've got by putting the least amount in? And I started looking at investments. So I realized that if I could just still save 10% of my income, but instead invest it in a way that would allow me to generate a rough return of about 8 to 10% or 8 to 12% per year, let's call it 10%, I was looking at a calculation that allowed me to replace the current income that I was on, which was about 40 grand, just under 40 grand, in 20 years. So I started doing the maths and I thought, well, that can't be right. Let me double check. And I did the maths and I realized that if I save 10% of my income and invest it at 10% return per year and let that compound, in 20 years' time, I would be able to draw off of that investment my annual salary without dipping into the investment. So it would be complete income replacement after 20 years. And that allowed for inflation, that allowed for everything. That's all I had to do. Now, 20 years is basically shaving half of your working life off. So that means you get 20 years more free time than most people that go to work. How does that sound? What can you do in 20 years, right? That excited me a lot. So that's what I went with. I started doing that. I carried on doing that. And I obviously wanted to know how I could enhance this system that I had. So as I became more au fait, I wanted to see if I could increase it. I was obsessed with the Pareto's law and how I could maximize output, and I was looking at different ways of doing so. And I carried on with a calculation. I was looking at my investments and I thought, well, there is actually certain things I can do here to reduce the time it takes to replace my income. And one of the things was to increase my savings. Okay, so I was every month when I got paid, I was chucking 10% of my savings into an account. But I figured out that if I could increase that every quarter, or even twice a year, that would have a dramatic compounding effect on the entire process of replacing my income. So I started doing some maths on that, and I realised that if I was to increase those savings by about 10% every quarter, I would be able to accelerate that. And what I also thought was, by doing that, by slowly increasing and sort of turning the tap tighter and tighter, it would make me more careful over what I was spending my money on, and it would also make me go out and motivate me to make more money. Does that make sense? Because you're sort of putting a governor on your income, but not at the degree where it's drastic. You're doing it slowly over time. So each quarter, it feels a bit tighter at first when you're adding that extra, 10% on. But, by 3 months gone by, you sort of acclimatise to it and you're able to then do it again. And what I did is I said, well, okay, if I can increase my savings by just 10% per quarter, that means that, month one, it's going to be 10%. 3 months go by, then it's going to be, I'll add 10% to that, so 11%. And then 10% to that, which is 12.1%, and so on and so on and so on. And I thought, well, if I can just keep doing this, what does the maths come out like? And in doing that and thinking that through, I thought, I'm actually going to be so driven to earn more money what is this actually going to do to my income? How am I going to actually, how can I use this to increase my income? Because I'm gonna feel the squeeze, so therefore I'm going to try and find more income somewhere. So I thought, well, what can I do? This is about 21 years old. I thought, well, what can I do to increase my income? And I thought, let's run some more maths. What if I started a business that allowed me to at least increase my income by about 10% per year? And I ran all this maths by, okay? So I went from saving 10% per every time I get paid for a return on between 8 and 12% per year. Let's call it 10%. That would get me out income replacement in 20 years, which I was happy with. Then I went from, well, how about if I not only do that, but increase my savings by 10% every quarter, and not only that, start my own business that will allow me to control my income, because you're in the destiny, your income is your destiny. You're in full control of your income when you start a business. So I thought, if I've got complete control over where my income is and how much money I can make, I can literally control how much income I generate each year. I can save more and more and more, and I won't feel the squeeze. But also, the more I earn, the 10% becomes a bigger a difference, and then the 10% each month, each quarter becomes a bigger difference. So I put it all together, and it spat out this result that I would actually reduce that time from 20 years down to replace my income to about between 10 and 12 years. So it's about between 10 and 12 years I was looking at roughly to replace my income. Now that's serious acceleration or serious reduced time in the workforce. So not only was I looking at halving my time in the workforce, I'm now looking at, 30 years off, 28 to 30 years off of my working life. And that really excited me. Okay, so that is when I started a business. So at the time I started talking about starting a business, I was confident in my skills. I knew I could start a business. I had it in me. I kept talking about it, and it was something that I just never seemed to get going. And a couple of years went by. I went from sort of 19, 20, 21, coming up to 22, and what happened is I found out that my wife was pregnant with my son. And at the time, having a baby was the last thing I wanted. And I made, I made no, I didn't put on a front. Make no mistake that I made it clear that I didn't want kids at that time. I said, this is probably the worst thing that can happen to me right now. And looking back, I don't think you're ever ready for that news. I don't think you're ready to know that you're going to be a dad at 20, pregnant at 22, like we had him when I was 23. You're never ready for that news, right? So we just found that out. We had moved to a bigger place because we obviously having a baby. So we moved to a bigger place over in Leatherhead. We bought a bungalow over in Leatherhead, and it was coming up to Christmas time. And at Christmas time, when you've sort of got the blues, where you've kind of Christmas holidays, you've spent a load of money, you've overspent on Christmas presents, you've got January blues coming out with all the debts where you're paying it off and stuff like that. And although I wasn't in a dire situation, it was kind of that time of year, gloomy time of year. And I remember thinking, when am I actually going to start this business? And over Christmas, we were sitting there wrapping up the Christmas presents, and I remember listening. We had Dean Martin and Nat King Cole on the radio, and I remember looking at my wife and saying, you know what? I was thinking to myself, when will I actually do this? When will I be in a position where my back is completely against the wall and I have to make it work, where there's no way out? And I have to start the business and make it work. And I looked at her and I said, I'm going to hand my notice in. And she said, oh, yeah, right. Like, this is your year. You're going to do it this year. Excellent. And I said, no. I'm going to hand it in now. And I literally picked the phone up and I rang the office, which was closed at the time. And I left a voicemail on the office saying, look, I'm starting my own business, and I'm not going to be working for you guys anymore. Thanks for the time, blah, 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 blah. When I come back in January, we'll discuss it, and I'll work my notice and all the rest of it. Anyway, I felt really good after that call. I felt like, I'd really taken action. I had to make it work. I felt like I had this son, this human being that I had to now create a future for. And it was an incredible feeling. And as I went back to work in January to kind of start working my notice, I thought I'd have about 4 weeks to work whilst I figured stuff out. They actually gave me 6 days. They gave me 6 days, and they said, listen, we don't need you. I think they were a bit fearful over, me poaching work and things like that. And they said, we don't need you. 6 days, you can go. That's fine. We will pay you a bit more, but we don't need you here longer than 6 days. And I thought, well, this is, the old pooper went. And I thought, wow, I've really got to make this work now. And that was it. Since then, I really didn't look back. I just went out. I, built this office in my shed, put a phone line out there, fax line out there, started to make it look much bigger than it was. I was always a fan of making things look bigger than they are. And I think every business does that anyway. You look at even the likes of Richard Branson trying to retain clients. They're always looking bigger than they are to obtain their clients. It's just on another level. And I've always been a fan of that, perception. And so I got all the T-shirts made up. I got the vans printed out and all this kind of thing. And I remember people would ring me and say, I've just seen one of your vans. And I would be thinking, yeah, I've done the quote for you, and I'm the estimator. I'm also the delivery guy. I'm also the van driver. I'm also this guy, that guy. And I was everyone. And it was very, very stressful at first. But everything I'd learned over the time and over the books that I'd read and everything, I managed to put decent systems in place. I employed staff, and I scaled the thing up. We did around 2.83 million pounds. 17 staff at the prime, plus a big team of contractors and that kind of thing. And what happened is everything was going to plan. I was accelerating my income. I was accelerating my savings. I was accelerating my return on investment. I was accelerating everything, and everything was going to plan. Only one thing, I became extremely frustrated with the industry. I absolutely hated the industry. Now, I've always been a firm believer that if you don't like something, let it go. Like, don't hold on to it. People in poison relationships that should have been over way before that they get out of them. People that have, are in bad situations and they don't need to be there. People who go to work and hate their job and just stay there because they feel they should. Absolutely, it's terrible. It's a waste of life. And I've never been into that. So I thought, okay, well, this is just a little blip. How can I tweak my system here? So I went back to the old drawing board and I said, how can I get out of this quicker? How do I want to sell the business? I didn't really want to sell it, and I didn't want to sell it because I didn't have the passion to build it to a position to sell it. I was so frustrated and resentful for being in that industry at that time. I didn't want to put systems in place. I didn't want to build teams and infrastructure so that I could then make it attractive and go and pitch it and all that kind of thing. I just wanted out of it. I really just wanted out of it. So I was looking at alternatives. And that's when I started to realize that there are speculative options out there. And I thought, well, if I could, everything that I'm doing is pretty safe and passive and solid. What if I look at some speculation? And that's when I started looking at poker. I started looking at poker, some other gambling options. I started looking at options trading, and I started looking at forex trading. So I was interested in the financial markets anyway. I knew a lot about money by then anyway. And I thought, well, I'll go for this because I've seen this little seminar that's taking place, and that's really what attracted me. And I'll talk about that whole journey another time. But essentially, I went into trading, and the purpose of trading was because if I could get kind of a 30-40% return on my trading, which would then average a 20% return across my entire portfolio, I worked out that I could actually replace my income at that point in time within about 5 years. So that really, really excited me. That meant that in 5 years, it was about 3 to 5 years, that I would actually be able to replace my income, be out of the game, and not have to worry about, dealing with that industry ever again. And I would be done. I would be done and free to figure out what I wanted to do and just focus all my time and attention on what it is I wanted to do. So that's where I started looking at trading, and it wasn't easy. I lost a lot of money. I lost around 40 grand in the markets. I learned a lot trading, about trading and what doesn't work, spending that 40 grand. But essentially that's what I did, and I was able to replace the income and not be reliant upon income from that industry ever again within 3.5 years. I actually done it in 3.5 years. It was a stressful time because I was running a business, then I was going home, spending time with my family. 10 o'clock at night, I would spend 10 till 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, learning how to trade, back testing. Weekends, I'd be in coffee shops back testing. And it was a massive, massive strain. But I knew that if I could do it, I would end up in a good place. So that's what I did. So that's really, hopefully that's just opened your mind on how to think about your own investment, your own income, and really why you're going to work, and are you maximizing what you're doing with your income. And over the course of this podcast, of course, I'm going to be sharing strategies and tactics on how I did that. But for now, I'm just allowing you to sort of let you in and explain my journey and why I made certain decisions, and really just open your eyes to the fact that this is possible. This is exactly what I did. So hopefully you've enjoyed that. I look forward to seeing you in the next podcast. Don't forget to share this podcast. Each week we're going to get more and more subscribers. Please make sure that you leave a review and rate the podcast. So you just got to click the stars or the little points and leave a little review. Just has to be a couple of lines and help us keep this podcast up the top of the charts and push it out to as many people as possible. So until next time, take care, and I'll see you then.
Subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss an episode. For news on all future events and updates, go to jasongraystone.com.